What can Israel do to combat the wave of dishonest war coverage splashed across international media? The New York Times ran a front-page photo of a starving Gazan child, later revealed to suffer from a genetic disease. While real starvation victims, Israeli hostages Evyatar David and Rom Braslavsky, are ignored by most media outlets, even after Hamas released chilling footage of their emaciated bodies. And France, the UK, and Canada push for Palestinian statehood. Hamas calls their statements the fruit of October 7th. We're discussing all of this and more on today's Jerusalem Minute. Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News. I am here in Jerusalem in the JNS Media Hub. Alex Trayman, CEO of JNS, he is in the United States. We're catching him through the amazing power of technology. Alex, welcome back to Jerusalem Minute. How's it going over there?
At an undisclosed location. Happy to be here.
It's great to see you. I hope you are enjoying yourself. And we're going to get right to the news. So much stuff going on this week. Top story over the last several days, Hamas and the PIJ terrorist organizations releasing videos showing the dire conditions of Israeli hostages Evyatar David and Rom Braslavsky. One of the videos showed David, 24, digging what he says will be his own grave and detailing severe starvation, while Braslavsky also appears on the verge of death. Let's go right to Prime Minister Netanyahu's response on Saturday night after watching those videos.
תראה אותם נמקים בצינוק, אבל המפלצות של החמאס שעוטפות אותם, להם יש זרועות עבות בשר, יש להם כל מה שהם צריכים כדי לאכול. הם מריבים אותם כמו שהנאצים הריבו את היהודים. וכשאני רואה את זה, אני מבין בדיוק מה החמאס רוצה. לא רוצה עסקה, הוא רוצה לשבור אותנו באמצעות סרטוני הזוועה האלה, באמצעות תעמולת הזוועה השקרית שהוא מפיץ בעולם. אבל אנחנו לא נשבר. אני מתמלא בנחישות עוד יותר חזקה. לשחרר את בנינו החטופים, לחסל את החמאס, להבטיח שעזה לא תהווה יותר איום על מדינת ישראל.
So there you have Prime Minister Netanyahu saying it is clear that the terrorists are being well fed, the hostages are being starved, saying that this is similar to the way the Nazis starved the Jews in the Holocaust. Prime Minister Netanyahu saying Hamas doesn't want a deal. They want to try to break us with this psychological terrorism. But the Prime Minister remains steadfast that Israel will achieve all of its goals, freeing the hostages, destroying Hamas, and making sure Gaza isn't a threat. Alex, I'm sure you saw those videos from where you are.
Well, I think the prime minister's right there that Hamas, they're not trying to keep the hostages as collateral. They use the hostages as psychological warfare. And you see here hostages that are intentionally starved. I mean, literally on death's door, one of them being forced to potentially dig their own grave. One where the father said, we're looking at our son starving to death right before our eyes. And the narrative around what's going on in Gaza is that Israel is starving the Palestinian population. But here, I think everybody gets to see that it's actually Hamas that is starving its Israeli hostages that it took specifically for the purposes of psychological warfare, for the purposes of dragging out this war. If it weren't for these hostages, Hamas would not be in Gaza anymore. Okay, I think everybody has to understand that. People want to know why this war is dragged on. It's dragged on because there's hostages. It's dragged on because Israel knows that they can't save the hostages militarily because there are kill orders on the hostages. That if the IDF will come near, that Hamas will simply shoot the hostages. So you see that Israel's caring about their hostages is harming the war effort. It's delaying the war effort. And meanwhile, when the international community accuses Israel of starving Gazan civilians, it's actually Hamas that is intentionally starving to death the remaining hostages that it holds. And it's hoping that Israel will cave in and, just agree to leave Hamas in power so that they can rescue these two dying hostages before they're forced to enter their own graves.
And of course, we have the media war. At the same time, the New York Times not hesitating to show a picture of what they said was a starving Gazan child. Later, it was found out that this, in fact, was a kid who was suffering from some sort of genetic disorder, genetic disease, not a result of starvation. New York Times then issuing a apology, if you want to call it that, somewhere on a back page, not reaching as nearly as the amount of those who actually saw the headline in the photo to begin with. And then at the same time, the New York Times not publishing the picture of the Israeli hostages. The New York Post, in fact, did publish the picture of one of the Israeli hostages suffering, starving there in Gaza.
Well, I think it's really important to look at what the New York Times said, when they issued their apology. Now, first of all, this was like a photo that where if you saw other photos in the series, you could see that there were other children there, another child that was, not starved at all. The mother's not starved at all. And the New York Times intentionally used this photo in order to depict what they project as a situation being in Gaza. And when they get called out on it, this is what they write. They write that children in Gaza are malnourished and starving, as New York Times reporters and others have documented. We recently ran a story about Gaza's most vulnerable civilians, including Mohammed Zakaria al-Mutawak, who is about 18 months old and suffers from severe malnutrition. We have since learned new information, including from the hospital that treated him and his medical records, and have updated our story to add context about his pre-existing health problems. This additional detail gives readers a greater understanding of his situation. Our reporters and photographers continue to report from Gaza bravely, sensitively, and at personal risk so that the readers can see firsthand the consequences of the war. Okay, where's the apology? That's not an apology.
Absolutely not.
I think that you see through this, what actually has been the strategy, right? In these two stories, on the one hand, take hostages, treat the hostages however you want in order to exact the psychological price from the Israelis. And then at the same time, use media manipulation in order to get the international community riled up against Israel, right? And to say that, and they just use whatever terminology, is sticking at the moment. So in the beginning, they're talking about genocide, right? And now you're seeing that, well, okay, maybe we can't prove that it's a genocide because really not that many people have been killed in the war. And actually, Israel's going to great lengths in order to reduce the number of civilian casualties, right? So how do we pivot then? So the next pivot is to starvation. And surely if the situation will continue and Gazan civilians will leave the strip, and I'll talk about that in a second, then they're going to pivot and say that this is ethnic cleansing. So, you can't win. And that's the whole point of the Hamas strategy. But what is happening now for the first time is that the international community is beginning to recognize that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza because the majority, maybe at least 50% of the homes of the Gazan people are destroyed at this point. The reason why they're destroyed is because they have been booby-trapped, okay? And you hear reports and reports, not from Israeli politicians, but rather from, reserves, soldiers that we know, you and I, that have been called up to battle, that tell you that every single building in the Gaza Strip is a battle, that they are all booby-trapped. And so therefore, the IDF has really had no choice but to destroy these buildings. So now there is a humanitarian situation. And because the international community is finally stating that there is this, and they're calling it starvation, which it isn't. But now we have the opportunity to try to flip the narrative. Israel has the opportunity to try to flip the narrative and to stay to the international community. Well, if you think that there's a humanitarian crisis here, if you think that there's starvation, so all you're doing about it is trying to blame Israel. There's nothing else you're doing except for trying to hold Israel accountable. But if you actually cared about the Palestinian people, what you would do is you would actually be willing to open up your borders to these so-called starving Palestinians. And we're not seeing any calls from the international community anywhere to say, hey, you know what? The Gazans are suffering and we'll be willing to take some of them in. Now, they'll be willing to take in refugees from any other situation in the world, as was proven in the Russia-Ukraine war, as was proven in the Syrian civil war, but they won't take in a single Gazan. Okay, they only want to try to accuse Israel of creating a situation that they actually want to last as long as possible, because the longer it lasts, the more you can blame and delegitimize and demonize the state of Israel.
Yeah, Alex, and there's no coincidence that Hamas is releasing those videos now. They feel emboldened by countries like France, the UK, Canada, those countries saying they will recognize a PA state, which is a reward for the October 7th massacre. And this isn't even other people saying it. Hamas is saying it themselves. You had a senior Hamas terrorist, Razi Hamed, on Al Jazeera, saying the initiative by several countries to recognize a Palestinian state is one of the fruits of October 7th. We proved that victory over Israel is not impossible, and our weapons are a symbol of Palestinian dignity. They are thanking those countries. Hamas is saying thank you to the UK, thank you to Canada, thank you to France. You have showed us that what we did on October the 7th is to our benefit, because you are now willing to recognize a so-called Palestinian state.
ليش كل الدول أصبحت تعترف بفلسطين الآن؟ قبل 7 أكتوبر هل في دولة تجرأت على أن تعترف بدولة فلسطين؟ أعطيني بس مثال. الآن حصاد 7 أكتوبر هو الذي خلى كل العالم يفتح عيونه على القضية الفلسطينية ويتحركوا باتجاهها بشكل قوي، إنه الشعب الفلسطيني شعب يستحق الدولة، يستحق الحرية.
You have countries that are supposed to be allies of Israel, democratic allies of Israel, the UK, France, Canada. They're all siding with Hamas, the terrorist organization, against Israel. Okay. They all saw what happened with the provisional Palestinian state that is Gaza, how that became a hornet's nest of terrorism. Okay. That was run by a terrorist organization. Well, once Israel was forced to fight back against this terrorist organization, that's when the international community turned on Israel and says that what Hamas did is actually justified. That's what they're doing. They're saying that Hamas's activities on October 7th were completely justified because they demonstrate the need for the creation of a Palestinian state in Israeli territory.
Alex, at the same time, President Trump's special envoy, Steve Wickoff, making a visit to Israel, meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. He met with the families of the hostages as well, saying that the United States has a plan to bring home all the remaining captives held by Hamas in a sweeping deal, and that will lead to the end of the war, according to recording of the meeting published by Channel 12 television. So it looks like right now, Israel and Hamas are not at a position where there's going to be some sort of deal for X amount of hostages. It looks like Wickoff has decided, because, of course, Hamas wants to hold on to the remaining hostages, that it's going to be an all or nothing situation. I think that's where we are right now.
Well, I think that's a healthy pivot. And we're seeing now a whole bunch of American officials in the region. You know, as we're recording this podcast, you have Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House in Israel. You have Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor from Arkansas, who is the daughter of U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, in Israel. You have other American officials there as well. First of all, they're seeing firsthand that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is actually doing a yeoman's job of delivering millions of meals to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and that where you're hearing claims of starvation, those areas where people are starving is definitely not the areas where the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is operating. To the contrary, those are the areas where the UN is operating to deliver food, because that food that is being delivered by the UN is being commandeered by Hamas, which is dangerous in its own right. So they're seeing firsthand the U.S. delivery of humanitarian aid to Palestinians. And unfortunately, the international community doesn't recognize just how important that initiative is, because it basically demands that the humanitarian aid bypass Hamas, which is really what the international community doesn't want, because as you see, the UK, France, Canada, you know, they're all trying to justify Hamas's activities, and ultimately they don't want Hamas to be eliminated by Israel. Now, I think what Steve Wickoff is doing right now is is what should have been done a long time ago. The idea of having these temporary ceasefires, these staged ceasefire agreements that allow for the release of some hostages and just allows the conflict to drag on for longer and longer and longer is not the right formula. The right formula for any kind of negotiated ceasefire is an end of war ceasefire situation in which all the hostages, living and dead, are released in one fell swoop. And that also includes the complete demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and Hamas laying down their arms and taking the exit ramp out. Where Israel will be allowing Hamas leadership to exile to another country. This is the formula that was put into place by Israel already a year and a half ago, but has not been executed, in part because Steve Wickoff was stuck on this formula that actually was a formula invented by the Biden administration. And it doesn't really make sense to me why Israel has continued along these lines. But now we're finally starting to hear that Steve Wickoff is saying, maybe this staged release is really not the right formula. I think that they're doing it because they feel a sense of urgency to end the conflict. And I also think that Israel is ready to end the conflict, provided, of course, that they get their hostages back, which is what Israel should have been saying from day one. They should have always been saying, the second you release all the hostages and you lay down your arms, this war is going to be over. But they haven't been stating that as clearly as possible. In fact, they've been losing, I would say, the narrative warfare because their talking points have not been as strong, because they haven't put their own spokespersons up front and forward as often as they should. But now we're seeing that Steve Wickoff finally turning around. But we don't know if this new formula is going to lead to an agreement. We don't know if it's going to lead to a release of the hostages. Hopefully, these images of the hostages, Eviatar David and the other hostage around.
Alex, as you said, in fact, Steve Wickoff with Ambassador Mike Huckabee going to Gaza on Friday, inspecting the efforts of the GHF. At the same time, Wickoff telling the families of the hostages there is no starvation in Gaza. He made that clear. He also said that Hamas might agree to disarm. Hamas then came out with a statement the very next day saying, no, absolutely not. Hamas has no intention of disarming as long as what they call, of course, the occupation exists. They denied those reports by Wickoff that they had intended to disarm at some point in the near future.
It's not surprising that they'll deny it. And I don't think we should be surprised if they don't accept the offer. Right now, what do they see? They see that the international community is doing their bidding. They see that the New York Times and the international media is promoting the narratives of starvation in Gaza, which is making Israel look terrible in the international community. They're seeing that the free countries in the world, France, UK, Canada, all preparing to recognize Palestinian statehood at the United Nations in September. Quite frankly, the only real ally that the state of Israel has right now that's of any meaning whatsoever is the United States. And the president of the United States even went as far this week as to put a post out stating that if Canada wants to recognize Palestinian statehood, that this will make their negotiations on a trade deal more difficult. So really, if it wasn't for the United States here, I think that Israel would be in a very, very difficult situation. Fortunately for Israel, the United States is the most important power broker in the world. They're the ones that have the U.S. veto, the UN veto at the Security Council. And, Steve Wickoff doing the bidding of the president of the United States, the president coming to Israel's aid, the president stating by a question, answering a question to a reporter stating that from what he can tell, there's no starvation in Gaza. And this all happened because of what Hamas did on October 7th.
Alex, you and I both know that Hamas, they are the modern day Nazis. Yet you have the European Union, specifically European Commission Executive Vice President Teresa Ribera, saying that the suffering of the civilians in Gaza is just like the Jews imprisoned by the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Holocaust. So while we know it's Hamas, they're the ones who are the Nazis, yet according to this socialist from Spain, and Spain hasn't been friendly to Israel at all over the course of the war. According to them, Israel, we're the ones who are Nazis, and we're the ones who are the evil, which is impeding our will on the Arabs there in Gaza.
You would think that the Europeans would have a special sensitivity toward the Holocaust to the extent that they wouldn't invoke it. You had 6 million Jews slaughtered systematically in the Holocaust. The systematic efforts that the Nazis made to kill Jews as quickly as possible. At certain points in Auschwitz, 10,000 Jews were being murdered a day. Okay, because they were systematically gassed to death and then cremated in a concentration camp. Meanwhile, Israel is going to incredible lengths that harm itself and its own war efforts to preserve and protect civilian casualties and collateral damage as they're fighting unmarked terrorists that are fighting from within a civilian population. And here you have the French and the Spanish and others, flipping the Holocaust narrative on its head. And we also saw this week that the mayor of Athens, you had Israel's ambassador to Greece stating that a lot of Israeli civilians, Israeli tourists rather, that are traveling to Greece don't feel safe going into Athens, in part because of anti-Semitic graffiti that is everywhere, that the city is refusing to erase as quickly as possible. And then you have the mayor of Athens shooting back and stating that, like, how dare the Israeli ambassador say anything to them? They don't tolerate any kind of racism within their territory, and that they go to great lengths to erase the anti-Semitic graffiti, and that Israel should be ashamed of itself even stating anything because of the genocide that it's committing in Gaza. So we are seeing how Europe is turning very, very hard on the state of Israel, and the state of Israel really emerging out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And it wasn't that long ago. We're only talking about 80 years since the Holocaust, but apparently a lot of Europeans have not learned the lessons.
Alex, this next report I think we have to take with a little bit of a grain of salt. 2 months before the second anniversary of the October 7th, 2023 massacre, 17 Arab countries came out signing a declaration saying they condemn the actions of Hamas. At the same time, though, in the same breath, they did not hesitate to denounce Israel. I would say take it with a grain of salt. Is there any significance, or is this just lip service from these Arab countries who, after almost 2 years, haven't said anything? All of a sudden, they are condemning, I guess, somewhat condemning Hamas, but at the same time taking Israel to task.
Well, it's a good step, by the way, that they condemn Hamas. I mean, that in and of itself, I think, is an important step. And here you see how that the Europeans are actually supporting Hamas in its bidding by giving Hamas exactly what they want. The Arabs are actually turning on Hamas. Now, they are stating publicly that that they are shocked by Israel's actions in Gaza. Privately, we know that they're saying that they want Israel to defeat Hamas. They want Hamas to be wiped out. They actually see Hamas and other terror organizations in the Middle East as a threat to their stability in their countries. But what we have to see is, one, if Arab countries will be willing to take in any amount of Gazan civilians into their borders. And then number two, if any of these countries are preparing to normalize relations with the state of Israel, provided, of course, that the war comes to a conclusion, Hamas is not left standing on the day after.
Alex, let's turn to some positive news here. Thanks to the United States administration, the State Department has reported to Congress that the PLO and the PA are not in compliance with their commitments in terms of taking actions to internationalize its conflict with Israel, going to the ICC, going to the ICJ against Israel, supporting terrorism, incitement. glorification of violence, and continuing down their pay-to-slay program. So the State Department has taken action here, imposing sanctions that deny visas to PLO and PA officials, saying it is in our national security interests to impose consequences and hold the PLO and PA accountable for not complying with their commitments and undermining the prospects for peace. So it looks like top officials in the PA and PLO are no longer welcome to travel to the United States, that their visas have been revoked. I think this is a positive development here.
Definitely a positive development. Very important for people to understand that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are two sides of the same coin. Okay. Uh, Sometimes different tactics. The Palestinian Authority has allowed Hamas to, to grow within the territories that it's supposed to control. Or the Palestinian Authority lost control of the Gaza Strip to Hamas in 2006, 2007. The reason why you don't actually have elections in the Palestinian Authority territories in Judea and Samaria, what the international community calls the West Bank, is because Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, understands that Hamas would win those elections. Okay, that the people support Hamas, that Hamas has been allowed to grow in those territories, that the Palestinian Authority doesn't do anything to prevent Hamas, and to the contrary, that the Palestinian Authority does incite the terror, promotes terror, finances terror with these pay-for-slay terror payments. And we've seen recent shooting attacks against Jews carried out by Palestinian Authority policemen, for example, which means that they're being armed by the United States, by Israel, in order to police the Palestinian Authority territories. And they turn those guns and they shoot Israelis with them. So the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, two sides of the same coin. Now, what's important about the United States announcement is two things. Number one, it means that as far as the United States is concerned, the Palestinian Authority is not a viable player to take over the governance of the Gaza Strip on the day after the war, which I know that a lot of members of the international community are pushing. Okay, fine, Hamas, we understand. Okay, Hamas, they have to be out, so just turn it back over to the Palestinian Authority. Well, we know that's not going to work, and the United States is stating here that the Palestinian Authority is not any better. The second thing that this is doing is it is taking air out of the balloon of the creation of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria, which is what France, UK, Canada is calling for. When they talk about a Palestinian state, who's going to govern that Palestinian state? They want the Palestinian Authority to govern that Palestinian state, of course. So here the United States stating clearly that the Palestinian Authority is no better, and they're revoking the visas. We'd like to see a future step possibly taken whereby the United States will officially declare the Palestinian Authority a terrorist organization over the pay-for-slay payments and incitement, right? As long as you're paying terrorists to commit acts of violence against Jews, that is financial sponsorship of terror. And they should be designated as a terrorist organization for doing that. Let's see if that will be the next step. But certainly, this is a method of preventing the creation of a Palestinian state, because the United States making it very clear that the Palestinian Authority is not a broker for peace. They're not a partner in a land for peace formula. Rather, they incite and finance terror.
Alex, while we're on the topic of terrorism here, you have victims of Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist attacks and their relatives suing the United Nations agency dedicated to so-called Palestinians, allegedly for aiding the armed groups and fueling terrorism. We're talking about UNRA here. The plaintiffs are seeking unspecified monetary damages for those terrorist attacks in which their friends and relatives were hurt. This is a different policy under the Trump administration, in which they're able to do so. Under the Biden administration, they were not allowed to sue UNRWA, but now things have changed thanks to Donald Trump's Justice Department reversing its stance on the issue, paving the way for this lawsuit against UNRWA. We know UNRWA was involved, representatives and members of UNRWA involved in the October 7th massacre directly. That has been proven to be a fact. So now you have these victims of terror going after this UN body itself.
I think it's so important, first of all, using the tools that Israel and the United States have in order to fight the whole terror infrastructure. I mean, what you see here with UNRWA was basically a terror deep state. supported by the international community, by the United Nations. You have this organization, UNRA, which is basically, puts a veneer over the Palestinian Authority, while at the same time, UNRWA is the biggest employer uh, in the Palestinian governed territories, and their members have been committing acts of terror. So you have this whole like money, billions of dollars being poured in, jobs being provided to Palestinians. You see that UNRWA is actually providing a cover for terrorism. And now finally, Israel, the United States, is able to fight back and to basically sue for tremendous amounts of damages against UNRWA members. And hopefully what we'll see is we've already seen the shuttering of UNRWA, but hopefully what we'll see is major payouts to victims of terror as a result. And we're seeing again how the Trump administration going after all the UN agencies, UNESCO, the Palestinian basically like heritage organization. Remember that they're the ones that called the Cave of the Patriarchs, where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives are buried, a Palestinian heritage site. All these UN agencies have been trying to undercut Israel's position. And directly assist and aid Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in trying to flip the narrative against Israel on the one hand, and also to commit acts of terror against Israel on the other hand. So what Trump is doing with his Justice Department and the administration is a very welcome step for Israel.
Alec, yesterday was Tisha B'Av, as you know, the 9th of the month of Av, a fast day commemorating the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem, along with calamities throughout Jewish history. But yesterday here, there was a positive development. The Beyadenu organization says that 4,000 Jews visited the Temple Mount, which is, I think, a near record number. Very, very positive development there. At the same time, you had National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir ascending the Temple Mount, openly praying at the site. A lot of people are upset by his actions. Defense Minister Katz pledging to reinforce Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem and its holy sites as Jews around the world mark Tisha B'Av. So Jews have limited prayer opportunities on the Temple Mount, our holiest site, while Muslims, of course, are allowed to pray there as they see fit. The Jordanian Waqf overseeing a lot of the activity there on the Temple Mount. So I don't know if you saw this, but what do you make of Ben-Gvir's actions there, praying, and just talk about in general the significance of 4,000 Jews going up yesterday on Tisha B'Av?
Well, you could see that the Temple Mount is still very dear to the hearts of the Israeli public. Many people, think that the Western Wall is the holy site, of the Jewish people. The Western Wall is the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. Where people pray at the Western Wall, this was the commercial street where people used to buy and trade, animals and money ahead of their ascension to the Temple Mount. And we've seen many, many more Jews ascending in greater numbers on the Temple Mount. It wasn't only Itamar Ben-Gvir. We saw that the deputy foreign minister, Sharon Haskel, went up to the Temple Mount on Tisha B'Av. Haskel, is not somebody that people consider to be a religious extremist. From the pictures that I saw, it looked like she actually got inside the Dome of the Rock, or at least went up to the Dome of the Rock, which is something that Jews, when they ascend the Temple Mount, are not able to do. Jews, when they go on the Temple Mount, they don't get to go inside the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They are simply escorted on a perimeter tour around the extreme edges of the Temple Mount on the west side and the east side. They don't get to enter into the holy shrines there. But what we have seen over the last period is increasing amount of Jewish prayer on the site. And in part, that's facilitated by Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's in charge of the police. And the police have been facilitating prayer on Temple Mount. And so you're actually seeing more and more and more Jews praying together in quorum, in the quorums of 10, what's called a minyan on the Temple Mount, praying out loud. It used to be that Jews were arrested even for just like moving their lips in personal self-prayer on the Temple Mount, but now actually singing songs, calling for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, praying to God on the holiest site where prayer was basically instituted as the Jewish way of connecting with God. on the holiest place. And it's really it's an issue of freedom of conscience. The idea that Jews will be able to go onto their holy site and not utter prayers. I mean, what you want in a peaceful situation is for individuals to be able to go up to a place and to utter prayers to their maker, to their creator, right? And so here you have, on the one hand, people supporting terror activities, and then on the other hand, individuals praying to God, and people saying that the praying to God is actually the trigger for violence. It's every narrative being flipped on its head. And the Tisha B'Av, this ninth day of Av, which is the day of remembering the calamity, and you had two Jewish temples standing on this site for collectively 800 years. You have a guide from the Muslim Waqf published as early as 1925 stating that this mountain is undeniably, indisputably the site of Solomon's temple. So we're finally starting to see a slow trickle of only a few thousand going up there, and stating the importance of this Temple Mount to Judaism, and offering prayer there. And hopefully we'll see even many more Jews offering prayer, because the Temple Mount is supposed to be a house of all nations, and it's supposed to be a house of peace. And when more and more people will go up to pray, that's where you're going to see more peace. It's when people are prevented from praying, and you don't have freedom of religion in a place, when you don't have freedom of conscience, that's when you start to see holy wars break out.
Alex, on that note, I think we're going to let you go. We're going to call it a day here. Thanks so much for joining us all the way in the United States. I want to give a shout out to our production crew behind the scenes: Ryan Lifshitz, Zach Sickerman, Yuri Svritsky, and Esther Eden. Alex, looks like we're going to be seeing you via our technology system here once again, all the way over there in the U.S. for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, we'll try to check in from wherever we may be, and look forward to being back in Jerusalem in a few weeks' time.
Enjoy yourself over there, Alex. Thanks so much. This has been another edition of Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News. I am in Jerusalem. Alex Trayman, CEO, is in the United States. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great week, everybody. And make sure you log on to YouTube to keep watching JNS TV for all the latest content. Go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. Have a great week, everybody.